have got to know whether or not their president is trusted.
Read my lips. No.
American people have voted to make a new beginning.
There is no limit to the greatness of America.
Yes, we can.
Hi there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, the sudden fall of an American hero and claims of a Watergate-style cover-up.
And the fiscal cliff is coming. Run for the fiscal hills or make a fiscal disaster movie. Just do something fiscal. But first, the fiscal news.
Heading the news from Planet America this week, the resignation of CIA Director David Petraeus over an affair with his biographer, Paula Broadwell. It has sent shockwaves through Washington. The ABC's Kim Landers has the latest on the spectacular fall for the four-star general known as King David.
It's like a mystery novel, isn't it? You couldn't write a Hollywood movie like this one. But we do know that the FBI has been investigating this matter for months. It began with an investigation into some harassing emails. And we're still unclear exactly when those emails showed up this affair that was happening between the CIA Director David Petraeus and his biographer Paula Broadwell. But at some stage during this investigation, completely unrelated, the FBI has discovered this affair. Now, why they kept it secret for so long and didn't tell the American people, nor indeed the president, about this, that his CIA director had become ensnared in an FBI investigation, we're now getting a little bit of information about. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, who oversees the FBI, has said today that during that FBI investigation they were secure in the knowledge that no national security had actually been breached as a result of this affair, and therefore they didn't see any reason to tell the White House or the President that this investigation into the CIA director was going on. And he says it was only very recently that they got to the stage where they thought, yes, they should tell the White House. And as we now know, the Director of National Intelligence was told on election night that the CIA director had been under investigation. He told the White House the next day. The President found out the day after that, and that's where we've ended up.
So, Kim, this has led to claims that this is all just a little bit too convenient, and something is still a little bit fishy about all of this. Maybe it's like the two-bit break-in at an office building that ended up being Watergate. Is there more to it? Do we have any way to know if that's just conspiracy theory or whether there is more going on here?
Well, a lot of people on Capitol Hill are very suspicious about this, and their suspicions have been raised by the fact that David Petraeus quit as CIA director just days before he was due to testify on Capitol Hill about that September the 11th attack on the US consulate in Benghazi in Libya. And they're saying, well, isn't this odd? He was going to tell us what he knew about that attack, and suddenly he's no longer the head of the CIA. Now, David Petraeus has made it known through the media that he is willing to testify about that Benghazi attack, and in fact he is going to testify before both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, even though he is no longer the director of the CIA. That testimony, however, will be behind closed doors. Now, those committees are saying, look, this is an investigation into the Benghazi attack. It's not an investigation into his affair. David Petraeus is making it known that he thinks the two are not linked, that there's no link between the affair, his resignation, and the Benghazi incident. But this is what Republicans in particular are very keen to find out. And some Republicans, including John McCain, want a Watergate-style inquiry into this whole affair. They're saying it's all very well for various congressional committees to take evidence behind closed doors, but they can't speak to each other. And he feels something akin to a Watergate investigation, an Iran-Contra investigation, is warranted in this case of Benghazi.
Kim Landers in Washington, thanks very much.
I've got to say, this whole Petraeus story is becoming a little bit dodgy. I just want to show you guys at home something, because we get all this overlay footage sent to us from the Associated Press, right? We're talking the high press here, not some tabloid rag. And this is the kind of footage they're sending out. Can we have a look at it? Now, AP's got some stalker camped outside Paula Broadwell's kitchen window, zooming in there, perving on her while she makes guacamole and drinks wine.
It's very suspicious-looking guacamole, though.
Apparently. He loves it. It's huge close-up. That's from the most mainstream press outlet there is. God forbid what the National Enquirer is doing. I think we're about 3 days from Paula Broadwell has sex with an alien.
Hopefully she'll just close the window first so we don't see it.
You'll go far in the press.
Thank you. Now, the other big story making news in Washington this week, the looming sequester cuts to defence and entitlement spending and the expiration of the so-called Bush-era tax cuts. If a deal isn't done, taxes will go up and spending will come down at the end of December when America hits the so-called fiscal cliff. Republicans want tax cuts extended for all, but President Obama says he has a mandate to make the wealthiest Americans pay a bit more.
And if there's one thing that I'm pretty confident about is the American people understood what they were getting when they gave me this incredible privilege of being in office for another 4 years. They want compromise, they want action, but they also want to make sure that middle-class folks aren't bearing the entire burden and sacrifice when it comes to some of these big challenges. They expect that folks at the top are doing their fair share as well, and that's going to be my guiding principle during these negotiations, but more importantly during the next 4 years of my administration.
And I come bearing graphs, John.
Nice.
We've heard a lot about dodgy metaphors about how steep the fiscal cliff is, how it's next to Debt Mountain that's made of treacherous inflation granite. Okay, I made that last one up.
I think you did.
It is actually serious business, and this is a graph of the most hardcore austerity packages of the last few decades. If we have a look, you can see that the fiscal cliff here for America is almost twice as bad as the UK's austerity measures in 2010. And it's right there next to Greece. And those are 4 words you don't want to hear, right next to Greece. But I think it might be useful to break the fiscal cliff down a little further because some parts of it are more damaging than others. Now, the graph on the left shows you how much money is being saved in 2013. And the graph on the right tells you how big a bite those savings would take out of the GDP. As you can see, the biggest issue by a mile is this yellow zone. They are the Bush tax cuts for the middle class. If you get rid of them, that will create about 55% of the savings. But they'll take 1.3% off the GDP. Neither side wants to do that. Obama's quite keen on removing the turquoise area. That's Bush's tax cuts for the wealthy. And that will only remove $42 billion a year from the deficit, but will have almost no impact on the economy whatsoever. The Republicans are quite fond of these $40 billion of non-defence cuts, which have a slightly outsized hit on the economy. And here's the defence cut, which everyone's trying to avoid too. That will also have an outsized hit on the economy for fairly little deficit reduction. So the question is, how badly do you want that deficit reduction? Because the costs are right in the laptop for all to see.
Also making news this week, Chaz, President Obama has visited some of the areas worst affected by Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, a fortnight and a half ago. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers are still without power today. The state's governor, Andrew Cuomo, has requested $30 billion worth of federal aid to help in the recovery effort there. The president toured Staten Island, large parts of which were devastated by the storm's surge. Following President Obama's rather comfortable Electoral College win this week, there have been some online petitions coming in eventually from all 50 states petitioning to secede from the Union. One petition from Texas has more than 100,000 signatures on it, although a counter-petition from the city of Austin, Texas, says that if the state leaves the United States, Austin will secede again in return and become rather like West Berlin was during the Cold War, a city within a state.
I'm sure that is on the cards, John. By the way, just in case it isn't obvious, that isn't going to happen. The Supreme Court ruled unilateral secession unconstitutional some time ago, but hey, it fills time on 24-hour news channels.
Well, if you're going to secede, you don't really care about the Supreme Court anymore, do you?
Good call.
All right then, wait and see. Meanwhile, former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, remember him? He spoke by phone to a group of donors this week, and he managed to make one final gaffe from beyond the political grave. Governor Romney told supporters he lost because President Obama gave, quote, gifts to members of the African American and Hispanic community and to young people in the form of student loans and free contraceptives. Governor Romney also said that he and his campaign were surprised that they lost and that he is sorry.
I bet he is sorry. I was going to say, the fact that Mitt Romney on that phone call described free health care for people earning $25,000 a year as a gift says everything you need to know about partisan politics in 2012.
President Obama, meanwhile, has been reaching out to his former rival this week, praising Governor Romney's management skills and suggesting that he might seek the governor's advice on the economy.
He presented some ideas during the course of the campaign that I actually agree with, and so it'd be interesting to talk to him about something like that. There may be ideas that he has with respect to jobs and growth that can help middle-class families that I want to hear. So, I'm not either prejudging what he's interested in doing, nor am I suggesting I've got some specific assignment. But what I want to do is to get ideas from him and see if there's some ways that we can potentially work together.
The British oil giant BP has agreed to a $4.5 billion settlement with the US government over the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. BP has agreed to a guilty plea on 11 felony counts of misconduct and neglect over the explosion and spill that killed 11 workers. It's estimated more than 4 million barrels of oil was spilled into the Gulf, and BP reached an earlier settlement with non-government plaintiffs for close to $8 billion. Critics have described the fines as simply inadequate. Now, there seems to have been something of a post-election afterglow showing through in opinion polls this week. President Obama's job approval rating has hit 54%, according to Rasmussen, and 53% in a Gallup poll this week. That represents the highest level it has been in 3 years now. And approval of President Obama's signature healthcare reforms has also ticked up. 43% of those polled by the Kaiser Family Research Foundation approve of so-called Obamacare now, while still 39% oppose it. Just 33% want Obamacare repealed.
The wonders of winning an election.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone loves a winner.
Yes, indeed. And no one told the political scientists that the election is over, though, because there have been some very interesting poll results in the blogs this week, all of them correcting some conventional wisdom from the election, trotted out by yours truly. Correction time. Firstly, we've talked endlessly about the importance of the economy for the election. Well, here is a strange graph. This maps the change in the unemployment rate between 2008 and 2012 versus the increase in Obama's election margin. Let's go to the laptop. If you look here, the more the unemployment rate has risen, the greater Obama's winning margin grew. I don't know what's going on there. It's very strange and counterintuitive. But when the unemployment rate did not rise much, Obama did badly, and yes, that was statistically significant. I can't believe it. I have no explanation for that. Try to work that one out for yourselves.
Well, the areas that are doing not as well, they think that Obama had the answers, identified with their problems, and so they voted for him.
And the people whose problems he solved...
Yeah, well, they didn't think that he solved them.
I guess not.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a good explanation as any.
Why not?
Secondly, I sounded off about how the House of Reps had been gerrymandered to the point that Democrats could win the election vote by 1% and still lose the House by almost 40 seats. Well, someone went away and modelled what would have happened had we kept the old electoral boundaries before the House was gerrymandered in 2010. And guess what? Go to the laptop. If we use the old electoral boundaries this year, the Dems would have won 7 more seats. That difference there between that and that. 7 more seats in the election, but still not enough to actually win the House. So the gerrymandering made no real difference to the result whatsoever, so I should just shut up about that. Finally, we've talked a lot about Obama only winning 39% of the white vote, but he doesn't actually have a white voter problem, but a southern white voter problem. When you crunch the exit polls from the election, you see that Obama actually averaged 46% of the white vote outside the South, did particularly well in the Northeast. It's in the South they averaged 27% of the white vote, and that brought his average down. And to be blunt, many of those states in the South are blood red and don't actually matter in any election. For that reason, they're safe. And I will no doubt be back in a few weeks with more polls to show why all these polls are wrong as well. But while I'm running hot, a big moment for our tweeters this week, the tweeters who love Ron Paul, when Ron Paul announced his retirement. Ron Paul's been a giant in what approximates the libertarian movement in America today, and he wasn't going out with one final swing. So here's a selection of the best and worst of Ron's 31 questions to Congress. Love him or hate him, let's hope he's not the last of his kind.
Why does the federal government restrict the drinking of raw milk? Why is there so little concern for the executive order that gives the president authority to establish a kill list, including American citizens, of those targeted for assassination. Why can't American manufacturers rope and other products from hemp? Why is patriotism thought to be blind loyalty to the government and the politicians who run it, rather than loyalty to the principles of liberty and support for the people? Real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, farewell, Dr. No. Now, remember that little kid, Abby, that we showed a few weeks ago, who was crying because she'd heard too much on Mum's car radio on NPR about Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, or Bronco Bama, as she called him. Well, it seems that Abby was pretty happy with the way the election panned out.
Guess what? Huh? The election is over.
Who's gonna be the president?
Bronco
Obama.
Yes.
Yay!
And so it was back to work this week for members of Congress and for Bronco Obama, and the two sides of political politics, well, they were dominated by two issues really, the fiscal cliff and also the resignation of General David Petraeus from the CIA. But it was also a case of back to politics as usual. Or was it? Has the balance of power shifted, rather, after Barack Obama's resounding election win and those Democrat gains, small as they were, in both houses? Jim Manley is a Democrat strategist and former advisor to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and the late Senator Edward Kennedy. We spoke to him earlier from Washington, D.C. Well, Jim Manley, welcome to Planet America. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Can we get your sense as to where the process of trying to avert the fiscal cliff in just over a month from now is up to this week? It seems that some of the ground rules are being laid down on Capitol Hill now.
Yep. I think, yes, some of the ground rules have been laid down. All the participants have laid out their initial negotiating positions. As of tomorrow, hopefully, when everyone meets at the White House, the time for posturing will be over, and folks can actually get down and start negotiating the nitty-gritty of what needs to be done. After all, there's less than 2 months to go before we get to the so-called cliff, and that's not an awful lot of time.
This so-called fiscal cliff, Jim, it's a man-made cliff. It was set up more than a year ago. What was the thinking there? Was it about saying, okay, we'll do it in the lame duck after the presidential election's out of the way, and there'll be political cover, there'll be greater room to move?
Well, that's probably part of it. The other part of it, can't blame a guy for being a little bit partisan, is that the Republicans were unwilling to deal with it last year during the so-called, the debt limit debacle, for instance, and/or with the super committee. The fact is, the natural inclination of the Congress in this time, given the political atmosphere, is just a punt. And unfortunately, the punting's already occurred. Now we're at the reality. So it's a long list of things that has to be addressed. There's no reason why we can't. But it's going to take some good, hard negotiating. But yes, it was a man-made creature, no doubt about it.
Jim, of course, the other big story in Washington this week was the unexpected resignation of the CIA Director, General David Petraeus, late last week, and claims as well that this could be a part of some wider cover-up that could also see the UN Ambassador, Susan Rice, somehow be prevented from becoming the new Secretary of State. What do you make of all of that?
I don't make much of it, to be quite honest. First of all, we begin with the premise that the whole idea that there's a so-called cover-up, Benghazi cover-up, I think is a phony and fraud of an issue. I think it's just driven by Fox News and the right-wing elements within this country. I think Senator McCain has gone a step too far with some of these comparisons. I note with great interest the fact that he was too busy giving a press conference yesterday to actually attend one of these classified briefings. From my perspective, I feel like she is well qualified to be Secretary of State, and if the President wants to listen to my advice, I would suggest that he go ahead, nominate her to be Secretary of State, and try to bluff McCain and Lindsey Graham, and see how many of their colleagues follow him, because the politics politics of this thing would be absolutely horrendous for them.
What does it say, do you think, Jim, about where Republicans are up to after the election defeat? It seemed that it was a genuine surprise. Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, others this week have said, you know what, we expected we were going to win that election even on Election Day.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I've known Mitt Romney since 1994 when I was a young staff assistant for Senator Kennedy when he challenged, when Mitt Romney challenged him for a Senate race. This is the same guy I saw in this race that it was in 1994. He's a flawed candidate. He's a flip-flopper. He lacks any core conviction, and the whole idea that he and his staff could completely misread the polls is just absolutely incredible to me. But the fact is, that's exactly what it looked like it happened. They refused to trust science. They refused to trust what they were seeing, and so they created some sort of alternative universe. You know, he should follow his staff should be fired for should have been fired for general incompetence.
It seems, Jim, there are kind of two prevailing opinions in the Conservative world now. One says that the party has lost its way. We've alienated too many important voting blocks, women, Hispanics in particular. The other says, hey, look, we got 49%, maybe a slightly better candidate. We would have won this thing, and it's always tough to beat an incumbent. Which of those do you think is going to prevail? Which version of reality of history are Republicans going to subscribe to?
Well, again, they rarely, if ever, ask me for my advice, but if they stick with number two, they're doomed to extinction for years to come, which would suit my purposes just fine. Look, the scientific fact is that increasingly in this country we are a nation of African Americans, Latinos, and Hispanics, and if the Republican Party fails to account for that, as I said a second ago, they're doomed to extinction for years to come. So, but I mean, there's obviously a time for reflection going on. Different sides are, jockeying for position. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. I'd like to think that Senator McConnell and Speaker Boehner recognize that the Tea Party's been bad for their party, speaking nothing about the economy, and that they're going to finally prepare to stand up to the Tea Party types. But we'll have to wait and see, because there definitely is a lot of debate going on within the Republican Party right now.
Jim, what hope is there for a more productive Congress from January? You've advised senior senators the last couple of years. It was very, very difficult to get past the filibuster on a whole lot of things. Yep. Is it looking any better for the next 2 years?
You know, I'd like to be able to tell you that it is, but if anyone thinks that Congress is going to change in light of what we saw during the last election, I would respectfully suggest they need to get their head examined. Something's going to have to give. We're going to have to try and figure out a way to drain the poison out of the system. But right now, unfortunately, I really hate to say it, I don't see any, things changing anytime soon.
So this is where, in a way, this whole process over the next month or so, over the fiscal cliff, it's not just about averting another recession, tax increase across the board, potentially damaging spending cuts. This could also set the tone. Are we going to see a cooperative period, or are we going to see a rather self-destructive period?
Yep, you nailed it exactly. I would suggest that how everyone involved handles the next couple months over the so-called fiscal cliff will define the next 4 years of President Obama's administration. If things go right, that could hopefully lead to, like I said, draining some of the poison out of the system. But if everyone just lapses back into hyper-partisanship, that doesn't bode well for the country, either in the short term or the long term.
Well, Jim Manley, it's good to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us from Washington this week.
Thank you very much.
Arguably one of the single greatest powers any president of the United States has is the ability to appoint justices to the Supreme Court. Well, Tell that to the Senate. Anyway, in his second term, Barack Obama is likely to appoint one or even two more Supreme Court justices. And as we saw in this year's battle over Obamacare, those justices can make a big difference. But history says presidents need to watch out when it comes to messing with the Supreme Court.
It certainly does. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s to try and drag the US economy out of the Great Depression, it was challenged as unconstitutional by the Chief Justice of the day, Charles Evans Hughes. Our next guest says that that fight has lessons for President Obama and the current Supreme Court as well. James Simon is a professor at the New York Law School and the author of a book about that particular period of time called FDR and Chief Justice Hughes, the President, the Supreme Court and the Epic Battle over the New Deal.
Catchy.
Yeah, I think so. He spoke to us from Boston. I guess a lot of us feel as though we know quite a lot about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his presidency in the 1930s and 1940s. Chief Justice Hughes, though, not nearly as well known, certainly over here. What can you tell us about him?
Well, Hughes is probably one of the greatest Chief Justices in Supreme Court history. He's particularly relevant today because he had to deal with a polarized court. He had four ideological conservatives and three liberals, and he and Justice Roberts were in the middle. Owen Roberts, it was. He was a brilliant lawyer and a fine judge. He was also Secretary of State before he became Chief Justice, and before that, he almost won the presidency. He ran against Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and had he gotten 4,000 more votes in California, he would have defeated Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and become president of the United States. So he's had quite an illustrious career. He also was a two-term reform governor of New York before that. So quite a very impressive career indeed.
Now, and it wasn't so unusual. William Howard Taft, who had made it to the presidency earlier in the century, became Chief Justice in the 1920s. So was it a more political court in those days?
Well, I guess you would have to say that. Taft was president and then became Chief Justice, and Hughes was almost president and became Chief Justice, but Taft had never been Secretary of State, and he certainly was not a reform governor of New York. So in some ways, Hughes not only had a broader and more impressive career, but in fact, I think he will go down as a much better Chief Justice than William Howard Taft.
When you're talking about conservatives and liberals on the court in the 30s, was it the same as conservatives and liberals today, where they basically always vote as a bloc?
Well, it's interesting. I think you would probably say that the conservatives on the court in the 1930s are not so very different from the conservatives on the court in 2012, in the sense that they do not like big government, they do not like regulation, and they're very much for a private enterprise. And I think that was certainly so in the 1930s. The conservatives were very much opposed to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the regulations that New Deal entailed. Today's court, as we found out in the Affordable Care Act decision, are against broad-based federal government regulation as well. So there are parallels, definitely.
The New Deal of the 1930s, I guess the shorthand in popular history now is that FDR's New Deal lifted the United States out of the Great Depression and it created social security and all these things that we now think are terrific. But in the day and in the face of the Supreme Court, just how contentious were these measures?
Well, they were not contentious in terms of the popular electorate. I mean, after all, Roosevelt was elected very handily in 1932, and he was reelected in a landslide in 1936. But the court, which, by the way, the Supreme Court generally lags behind the American voters in terms of political issues, the court was more conservative. You had four conservatives known as the Four Horsemen, and then you had two centrists, one being Chief Justice Hughes, who were appointed by Republican President Herbert Hoover. We could move forward to 2012 with the Affordable Health Care Act, that you have the four conservatives, and had Chief Justice John Roberts gone along, there would have been a majority to strike down the entire Signature Health Care Act of President Obama. So you have that parallel. In the 1930s, the Hughes court struck down two major pillars of the New Deal. They struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was the major industrial legislation, and they struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was the major agricultural legislation to try to pull the country out of the Depression.
Although I guess from what you're saying, the difference between then and now is that the legislation then was more popular than the legislation now. Like, Obamacare does not have a huge majority support, and neither does anything that Barack Obama's really done, compared to some of the legislation you're talking about from the 30s.
You're quite right. That certainly the New Deal legislation was, first of all, passed very handily. Secondly, Franklin Roosevelt was a more popular president than Barack Obama.
These days, especially liberals are running around going, the court's broken, the whole system's going to pot. Was the same kind of situation happening in the 30s? Were people saying the same things then?
No, sure. The person who had the loudest voice was Franklin Roosevelt, who was so angry at the court that he proposed a court packing plan, which, of course, I've written about. In 1937, after he'd been reelected by a landslide, he came after the court, and he said he wanted to try to reform it by adding one justice for every sitting justice over 70 years old. At that time, 6 of the justices, including Chief Justice Hughes, were over 70 years old. If his plan had gone through, if the legislation had passed, the court would have gone from 9 members to 15 members, and of course Roosevelt would have had a majority who were very sympathetic to the New Deal.
Why didn't that succeed?
Well, because I think the American people were terribly concerned, even a popular president like Roosevelt, sort of mucking around with an institution they all respected, that is the Supreme Court. They might not have liked individual decisions of the court, but they revered the institution. And of course that's so, and it was so in Bush v. Gore in 2000 and in 2001, and I think it's true today.
Well, Professor Simon, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And joining us this week at the roundish table, Dr. Adam Lockyer, lecturer in US politics and foreign policy at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome.
Now, the fiscal cliff, we've been talking about it a bit this week. Jim Manley earlier, former advisor to Teddy Kennedy and Harry Reid, says this isn't just about avoiding tax-mageddon or whatever they're calling it, but also it could be a defining moment for Barack Obama's second term. Do you agree? Is there that much writing on it?
Oh, that's right. So what we're really trying to get grips with is, well, what's going on with the Republican Party? Because if you think that for the last 2 years the paralysis in Congress has been a strategy just to make Obama a one-term president, and so therefore they've just been obstructivist because they're trying to make him lose this election. Therefore, they should be more cooperative, and we should be able to find a solution before the fiscal cliff.
Unless they want to lose the next election for the Democrats as well.
Well, yes. Or you might just think that they've been obstructivist because of ideology, because they've all signed the Norquist pledge that they're never going to raise taxes, that they're going to just vote down all raises in revenue. If you think that's what's been driving the paralysis in Congress, well, then you won't see any solution before the fiscal cliff.
Could we see a switcheroo and have Democrats say, well, not so fast, you know, we're not prepared to reach across the aisle, you know, we've been there for the last 2 years. I mean, could they get difficult now?
Perhaps, because, I mean, many say that if the Democrats let the US economy go over the fiscal cliff on the 2nd of January, then the whole argument changes. Then all of a sudden the whole argument turns to, well, we're going to decrease taxes. And now we've got Democrats and Republicans working together to try to roll back the damage done by the expiry of the tax the tax cuts.
One thing that has changed since the last time they went round a year and a bit ago, though, is Barack Obama. In that he at the time he was trying to play conciliatory and passive and let Congress do their thing, and he just took a huge bullet in the polls, went way, way, way down, and then he started to get aggressive towards the end. Clearly he's come out swinging from the beginning now. I guess he can afford to. He's already won his election, and he saw that didn't work the last time doing the passive thing. Do you think that will make any difference, or is it just down to Congress?
Well, no, I mean, he wants to get a solution now. It's in Barack Obama's interest to get a solution to these problems during the fiscal cliff period. If he kicks the can down the road for another 6 months, then the political dynamics change, and therefore he has less leverage over Congress than he does at the moment. So right now he's got a ticking time bomb underneath Congress, and he wants to use that for his full advantage.
There's been this constant refrain in Obama's first 4 years that said that he wasn't assertive enough. He wasn't giving enough direction to Congress. And yet, historically, Congress, if you present them with a fait accompli like the Clintons did in 1994 with healthcare reform, they said, "Whoa, that's just holding a gun at our head. You know, we have a part to play in this process as well." How do you strike that right balance? A president who leads yet consults and works with Congress?
Oh, it's a difficult balance, and I think that Obama's natural instinct is to be conciliatory, to sort of get the Republicans and Democrats around the same table and say, well, what do we have in common? What interests do we share? Let's move forward on those interests. And in this particular issue, what those interests are that they both share is they don't want taxes on the middle class and the poor. Where they disagree is on that 2%, so those individuals earning more than $250,000 a year. Now, if Congress was to pass laws tomorrow, Obama would sign those straight away.
Is it too cynical to say that sometimes Congress likes to be pushed around by the president because it gives them a certain amount of political cover, and it's sort of like, well, you know, this is the best deal we could get?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that in this case, that's probably not going to be what's happening here, because like I was saying, it really comes down to, well, what cause do you think is driving the obstructivist policies strategy in Congress? So if it is ideology, then it really doesn't matter what Obama says, whether he tries to push them around or tries to be conciliatory. They're going to just have their blinkers on. We're not going to raise taxes no matter what.
And one thing we probably shouldn't forget about this issue is that there's a whole bunch of unemployment benefits tied up in this issue that everyone forgets. They all talk the tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, but there's a whole bunch of people who are about to get cut off from unemployment benefits in December if something doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, this is what happens is that when we're talking about Bush-era tax cuts, they add up to about $400 billion, but it's a whole series of things. It's payroll taxes, it's healthcare affordability, it's also just in terms of income tax breaks as well. So it's a whole bunch of tax breaks, and it gets really complicated, which then sort of moves us forward to, well, they've only really got 2 weeks left. Next week is the Thanksgiving break. They come back officially for 2 weeks in December. Can they sort of unpack all these complicated tax and reforms within 2 weeks? And it's going to be a difficult task.
A bit of overtime, I think.
Talking about complicated foreign policy, we've been watching the Petraeus scandal for puns and jokes and front page laughs, etc. Let's get serious about this. This guy was a popular and competent head of the CIA. Him going, does it make any difference to foreign policy or the CIA, or does the system just go on?
Yeah, not really. So, I mean, it involves both spies and espionage and a sex scandal. So this is always going to grab headlines and hold it for an extended period. But in terms of the strategic and political impacts, it's going to be pretty minimal. Strategically, Petraeus was made head of CIA to better coordinate CIA's activities in Afghanistan. And now they're winding down. So over 2013, US operations in Afghanistan are going to be winding down. So he would have sort of very quickly outlived his usefulness, and if he hadn't already. And in terms of the politics, Benghazi was always going to be a circus, a political circus in Congress, and so this is going to add more wood to the fire, but overall it was always going to just be really theatrical, and so this is going to add to that.
Is this that circus you talk about, one of those being drawn into the 3 rings is Susan Rice, the US ambassador to the United Nations, who was out there right after the Benghazi attacks on the weekend talk shows in the United States saying this was a terrorist attack, this was about the anti-Islamic films and so on. That was the line at the time. Part of this is, of course, because she's on the short list, we understand, to replace Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. So there are potentially very high stakes here in terms of Obama's national security team.
Yeah, so, I mean, getting confirmation into Secretary of State in particular is always a blood sport going through Congress. So, and this is just getting revved up for that. This is a warm-up. And so we see John McCain coming out and attacking Susan Rice. But that's just warming up for what's about to come.
The week just gone, we saw Hillary Clinton in Australia, Leon Panetta as well. Interesting timings. As Osmin was going on, former Prime Minister Paul Keating made a speech which had been scheduled months in advance, apparently, before that meeting had been scheduled. But he was essentially saying Australia is too close to the United States. We shouldn't be having Marines being posted in the Northern Territory. We have to be careful about being anybody's deputy in the region. What do you make of those comments and the timing too?
So I think that, well, the timing is probably coincidental. And I think that he's not completely wrong, that Australia, of course, needs an independent foreign policy and needs to probably strike out a little bit more in the region and engage, in particular, with Indonesia. So we've been having these Osman conferences since 1985, and we don't have anything similar with Indonesia, which seems a bit strange. And so we can sort of take Paul Keating's views on that, and I accept those.
So is our relationship with America stopping us doing those things
no,
in Indonesia?
No, not at all. And I think that China's rise in particular has many countries in the region concerned. So we talk about the United States coming to balance China. It doesn't need to. All the states in the region are already starting to balance China, like South Korea, Japan, and even Indonesia and the Asian countries.
Do we have a sense as to how we've been focusing on Beijing, but do we know how Jakarta feels about the fact there are a couple of thousand US Marines going to be on their doorstep?
They weren't so concerned about that. What they were concerned about was the potential to base UAVs, the drones, on the Cocos Islands, because what they will be doing is flying off into the Malacca Straits and off into the South China Sea. So basically flying over Indonesian airspace the whole time. And this is going to be sort of negatively impacting upon Indonesian sovereignty, and that was what they were really concerned about.
All right, Adam Lockyer, great to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us at the Roundish Table this week. And that is all the time we have for another edition of Planet America.
We still have our awesome closing titles, John. All because people see them every week doesn't mean they're not great, fantastic closing titles. Don't forget the closing titles. They're great value. I love the closing titles.
I really don't think we've got time. I don't think we haven't got time for a promo.
We have the closing titles next week. Next week's closing titles.